Senator Ludlam.
Yes, I've got a list here. Thank you very much, Mr Deputy President, and I thank the Senate. The Australian Conservation Foundation Sustainability Index was released this morning. It provides an insightful and quite alarming snapshot of the comparative performance of Australia's largest cities. It contains 15 different indicators which cover key social, economic and environmental factors. It shows the ability of each city to sustain its population within its environmental means, and within overall parameters of amenability and livability. And I suppose that's the first thing to take away, is that this is not simply a list of environmental indicators. This is the footprint and the impact that our cities are having on the biosphere that sustains and supports them. And it goes into quite a bit of detail across 15 different indicators. It deals with environmental performance and looks at indicators around air quality, ecological footprint and so on, and water consumption, quite critically. It looks at quality of life indicators using things including health, proxies for health, indicators around transport, unemployment and subjective well-being and so on. So it's quite broadly framed. And a third category of indicators are around resilience, which is a key word which I suspect we'll hear much more of. Climate change steps as identified by the Cities for Climate Protection 5 milestone process, which we might talk about more later if there's time, public participation rate, education and so on, local food production. So it's a very well-rounded set of indicators. It's by no means definitive or exhaustive, but it is, to my knowledge, the first time that this has ever been tried to come up with a set of indicators of overall sustainability of our largest settlements and then try and rate Australian cities relative to each other to see how we're collectively doing. It's based on the best data sets that are available, and in some cases I think some of the important takeaway messages are the gaps in data and information that we don't have, or that the Australian Conservation Foundation and its partners didn't have when they were collating the material to put this report together. And I think some of the more important flow-on impacts might be taking a good look at what information we need to be collecting and doing better at. Not a single Australian city scored well on the index. All cities are hovering in the middle range, and effectively what we're measuring here is relative degrees of quite average performance. This is not abstract. This is not something that's academic that means we'll just need to do a little bit better next year. This measures the ability of our settlements in Australia to survive the challenges, the non-negotiable challenges of the 21st century. No longer distant challenges. These are issues that are upon us right now, and we are sleepwalking into them. That's one of the most important takeaway findings from this report, is that Australian cities, despite 20 or 30 years of the kind of debates that we've been having in here, are not ready across a very wide range of indicators. Darwin ranked first with a score of 119. We may hear more from some senators from the Territory about that. 0 was given to be the best performance. So even Darwin, which for a variety of reasons performed the best against the kind of metrics that ACF were measuring against, only scored reasonable. Not a single Australian city was good, was a world leader. 3 Queensland cities came next, with the Sunshine Coast, Brisbane and Townsville being placed 2nd, 3rd and 4th respectively. And it starts to show and give credit to some of the extraordinarily good work that's been done, not just in these cities that ranked very high, but right around Australia. There have been initiatives that have been piecemeal but incredibly valuable, and we have those to thank, those that came from state, local and federal government, ones that came from the community sector, from non-government sector and from the business community. They've been piecemeal, they've been uncoordinated, but at least they've saved us from being much worse than we are. Perth, my own hometown, came last, came 19 out of 20 cities because there were 2 ranked equal 14. That's an alarming outcome for a city that prides itself on its clean green image. And I think as much as when you get into the nuts and bolts of the detail, it does give credit to the extremely good work that's been done in a couple of areas. It shows overall that the capital of Western Australia is quite simply unprepared for the challenges that it faces. I'll go into a little more detail. Perth scored very well on education and on employment, but it had the worst possible score for ecological footprint, which is in itself an amalgam of different indicators. On transport and on water, we've still got among the lowest mode share for public transport of any major Australian community, despite the fact that we've got a world-class heavy rail network. We're missing a vitally important link, and of course the Australian Greens believe that that could be filled by light rail. The ecological footprint for Perth says the report is 7 hectares per person per year, or a little over 7 per person per year. The EPA's State of the Environment report calculated using a slightly different methodology, calculates it at 14.5 hectares per person per year. And so when you hear people say if the entire world was trying to live the way we do here in Australia, we would need another 3 or 4 planets, that's where that kind of statistic comes from. Because if we took the global availability of resources, water and so on, per capita, according to some kind of principle of global justice which says every human being on this planet deserves access to the same resources, we would need to be living on less than 2 hectares per person. And Perth, scoring the very worst on this indicator, is somewhere between 7 and 14. And that's just how far we've got to go. That's why one of the reasons that we're at the bottom of the list. We got one of the lowest possible scores for transport. And again, this may be in part an artefact of the data that was used, and that gives us some signs that we probably need to collect it better. But we do have the highest rate of vehicle ownership in Australia. And Australian cities are amongst the least dense and most car dependent of any on the planet. And we've been getting away with it because of cheap oil, quite frankly. Because of a long period of cheap oil, we had a huge fright and a near miss a couple of years back when oil prices spiked, and that seems to have been forgotten. When you ask the Commonwealth Government who is the lead agency on oil depletion and our unique oil vulnerability in Australia, nobody seems to know. We are still flying blind. Western Australia also scores very poorly in water consumption because we seem to have this dependence or this institutional reliance on groundwater mining projects and extremely energy-intensive water desalination. And there's been very little thought given in WA, apart from some extremely good research over the last few years about decentralising water infrastructure. Waste and recycling is not included in this indicator, although it would be incorporated by proxy in the ecological footprint. But again, points to initiatives like container deposit legislation, which the NT has, South Australia has led with years and years ago, that the Commonwealth Government is still balking and studying to death while a good idea goes begging. There are ideas that we could be implementing right now so that next year, not just that the cities have changed order and that we're comparing each other in slightly different ways, but that, in fact, all Australian communities have moved further up the scale. This is not in order to get some gold star. This is in order to survive the very real imperatives of the 21st century, of climate change, of oil depletion, of water depletion, of food, and of basic expectations of quality of life. And at the moment, I think we're simply coasting along, assuming that things are going to stay the same as they have, and that's why we are still seeing budgets brought down at a state and federal level that would have served us very, very well for the 1950s and 60s, but are grossly mismatched for the challenges that we face today. One of the things that I would like to conclude with is the Rudd government's promises of infrastructure spending, because for the first time in a generation we are seeing the Commonwealth getting in a tentative way back into the business of urban public transport. This is a subject that's very dear to my heart, but we are still seeing an overwhelming reliance on road funding, on building more roads to get more traffic onto those roads, while continuing to underfund public transport, or just assuming that one day the states will get their act together and that there'll be something to fund. The Commonwealth can play a role. We're hearing some of the right language, but it's not being reflected in the actions, because in the last Commonwealth budget, handed down in here a couple of weeks ago, there wasn't an additional dollar, not a single additional dollar for public transport spending anywhere in the country. What we're seeing instead is this sense of infrastructure being something that mining companies are asking for and get. Infrastructure is, let's make northwest ports larger. Let's provide railway infrastructure and expansions for coal companies. That is not what the Greens mean when we talk about infrastructure. When we talk about infrastructure, it means survivability, resilience and thriving into the 21st century. In the mining communities in particular that I represent in the northwest of WA, when we're talking infrastructure, they're actually not demanding, those communities, larger ports or more expensive housing. They're demanding basic healthcare, they're demanding education, they're demanding transport and telecommunication systems. These are economies that have been stretched to the brink. We are flying in and flying out people to clean schools in Karratha at the moment, and that simply cannot be maintained. Infrastructure, I think people need to be very aware that when the Rudd government uses that word, it appears to mean something very different. When the Greens use that word, we mean the infrastructure of sustainability, whether it be light rail in our major cities, whether it be renewable energy infrastructure and smart grids, or whether it be basic community healthcare and education services, which people in our wealthy inner cities certainly take for granted, but in the mining centres in Western Australia and other regional communities across the country simply don't take for granted, and it's about time that everybody was given access to the same opportunities. I commend ACF on producing this report and look forward to seeing how we do next year.